All right. So once again, hello, Dr. Dru Johnson from the Biblical Mind. Thank you so much for joining me today. But I have to know just what on earth were you thinking when I just tweeted you and said, hey, Biblical Mind is my favorite podcast. I'd love it if you would be a guest on mine, on my little
Yeah.
small podcast.
Well, I'm always glad that people listen to the Biblical Mind because I have fun doing it. And so I'm like, oh, somebody likes it. And I've been podcasting for about 9 years, all interview style podcasting. And so whenever, I know what it's like to ask people out of the blue that you don't personally know. So,
Right.
um, so, yeah, I'm always happy to get on there, especially if you're going to let me talk about my work, then, of course I'm going to go on there because I love to talk about the stuff that I get to do. So,
Well, that's great. That's great because I certainly love to hear about it. I am, confession, I am about like 5 or 6 episodes behind on the Biblical Mind right now, but
oh,
I'm catching up. I'm catching up.
some good stuff coming. And the Biblical Mind, I always say it's a variety show. Like we don't do one thing. We don't talk to one type of person. In fact, we just put out last week interview with Alyssa Wilkinson, a former colleague of mine, who we both lost our jobs together at the same time when our college closed. But she went on to become a New York Times film critic, right? So
Yeah,
so
right.
so I just happen to know her now. So yeah, but she does great work. So I just like talking to people who are interesting.
That's great. So do I. So we connect on that. That's good.
Yeah.
But okay, so the first thing I want to discuss, I'm really interested in this Abrahamic project that you're doing that I've been
Mm.
hearing about on a couple of the podcasts. So I'm not sure how deep you can go into it, but
Hmm.
if you're able to just kind of explain that, go for it.
Yeah, in some ways it's a very simple idea, but very tricky to pull off. And so it's basically in the scholarly world, we like to have conferences where we get together, you present papers, and these papers are very formal. I mean, they're papers where you're going to eventually publish them in a book or in a journal. They're very nerdy, very technical. So the Templeton organization, which does a lot with religious pluralism and science and faith kind of intermix, they basically said, "Hey, would you like to head up a project?" They came to me, so that was great. I didn't have to go to them, which was amazing. And said, "We really want something like this project that I participated in called the Creation Project, where it was getting lots of different Christians together and talking about mostly from the evangelical Protestant tradition, but
Hmm.
just scientists and theologians and biblical people like me, and saying, okay, how do we reconcile the evolutionary science with the creation narratives and the creation story and what we think creation is? And he had everything across the board. He had views, like people who basically did not take the creation narrative, like they just didn't even care. Like they're just like, I don't know what to do with that over there. All I know is what us scientists say. All the way to people who were just like 7 day literal creation, all kinds of people who had integrative models, everything in between, lots of interesting stuff. So Templeton said, "Hey, how would you like to do that? But instead of just with Christians, do it with Jews, Christians, and Muslims, which are traditionally called the Abrahamic faiths, even though that's not quite the correct term. But we just mean Jews, Christian, and Muslim scholars. So that's what we're doing. We put it at Oxford in a Wycliffe College or Wycliffe Hall at Oxford, which is one of the 46 colleges at Oxford University. Um, mainly because A, I've worked with the UK before, with universities in the UK before. B, the people at Wycliffe are great. It's a small college. I mean, they're all kind of small, but it's smaller, and they were really into it. They train Christian ministers and they do all kinds of other Christian theology stuff. But they were very interested in having Muslim and Jewish scholars in their college for a while, to have interactions with. They see that as a benefit to their students, which was
Hmm.
great. And then, at the end, kind of like the podcast, at the end of the day, I have to invite scholars from around the world to show up for events for these workshops that we did, that we're doing. And you have to kind of do it in a place they want to go. Like, if you really want them to show up, I could do it in Kankakee, Illinois, if I wanted. But everybody likes going to Oxford. Even people from the Middle East like going to Oxford and Africa. So it's an easy place. And actually, from reaching from around the world, it's actually kind of an easier place for people from Asia and Africa to get to than to America.
Okay.
Um, I'm really glad we did it now because, like, I mean, all in all honesty, we can't host anything in America right now because we can't guarantee that our Muslim scholars will not be turned around at the border. So
Right.
it's one of
Right.
the logistical problems we're facing. Hopefully, we can come back to doing things in America as well.
Yeah, hopefully so. Well, that seems like a lot of work. I also would like to go to Oxford at some point in my life.
Yeah,
I'm
it's a
also
nice
blown
little
away
town.
by it.
Yeah, yeah. It's a beautiful town, easy to walk around. Oxford's a weird town because there are three, at least three cities in the United States that are, or sorry, in the UK. It's Oxford, Cambridge, and then St. Andrews, where I did my PhD.
Hmm.
Um, there may be others, but those are the ones where basically the whole town is the university, or at least the old part of the town is the university. Which also means that it's a university about half the year. The other half of the year, it's all tourist. Um,
Wow.
and if you're an Oxford student, you don't even live in Oxford for more than half the year. Like you couldn't even apply for residency in the city of Oxford. The rest of the time, it's pure tourist. I'm going back in 2 weeks for some meetings, and I'm kind of dreading it because over the summer, it's just like giant tour groups, people walking, clogging the side like cattle on the
Oh
sidewalk.
man.
So yeah, yeah. So when you go, it's best to go during the semester when the students are there because you kind of get to see it in action, and there's less tour groups. So they're still
That'd be
there, but
great.
there's fewer of them. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll keep that in mind for sure. So, kind of touching on like evolution and faith, I know that you wrote a book called What Hath Darwin to Do with Scripture? It's on my TBR.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Good.
so, and I know some of the more recent podcasts you've done, of course, are centering on that. So, I know you briefly mentioned it, but how are you hoping that this can bridge the gap between science and faith?
Yeah, so my work is obviously is aimed only at Christians, although there's all kinds of interesting overlap. I have Muslim and Jewish colleagues where there's all kinds of interesting overlap between us,
Hmm.
but obviously we have different theological impulses, and even sometimes the scripture becomes an issue because for Jewish scholars, the Talmud and the rabbinic tradition can play a heavier role than
Right.
for Christians. Um, but for me, essentially, the biblical mind is essentially saying, what do the biblical authors think about various topics, and how can we explore that in a responsible way, and how can we help other Christians who aren't scholars and who don't have the time to do all this work? How can we help them think through those issues? The Darwin book was really just a test case for that project. So I've been working for the last 17 or almost 20 years. Um, on this view that the Bible is an intellectual tradition and that when we see it only as a spirit, I actually believe it's a spiritual tradition too, but I might mean spiritual in the way that Paul means it in a kind of logical, intellectual, whole person, whole community view.
Okay.
Um, and the more we ignore that it's an intellectual tradition, and I mean, like, you don't have to have a college degree for it to be an intellectual tradition. That's for children. I mean, I've almost always been in churches that were all blue collar, working people, people that had a high school diploma, kind of places, immigrant churches as well when we lived in New Jersey. Um, and so everything I'm saying equally applies to the children, the old people, whether you have a high school diploma or not. It's an intellectual tradition that it should shape the way that we think about the world
Hmm.
by listening to God's guidance through his prophets and putting into practice the things that they think are just necessary to be a follower of God in the Hebrew Bible and a follower of Jesus in the New Testament, that we will see the world better rather than worse. I won't say right versus wrong, but we will see reality better. We will understand it. We'll be able to discern what's actually going on better rather than worse. So so that sounds great, and I can talk about, like ethical decisions we should make according to scripture or not. But I thought I was really interested in the science religion discussion. I always have been writing on that. Um, and so I thought, okay, the test case is, can you put Darwin's ideas in conversation with the biblical authors? And would the biblical authors have something to say?
Hmm.
Now, it turns out they had a lot to say about it. In fact, they're the only people in the ancient world who ever talked about the same things that Darwin talked about. And by that, I mean, if you just take Genesis 1 through 11, in the book I go through the rest of scripture, but if you just take Genesis 1 through 11, so that's creation all the way up to Babel. Um, they now it might not be obvious in the English. I will also point that out. There are a
Okay.
few places where I don't like to say like you need to know Hebrew in order to understand this. You don't need to know Hebrew in order to understand Genesis 1 through 11. But when you know a little bit of Hebrew, things in Genesis 1 through 11 pop, like they get lit up, it becomes three-dimensional in ways that it can't in translation.
Yes, I'm teaching myself Hebrew, so I'm kind of
Oh, okay.
noticing
You're
certain
seeing
stuff
things.
like that.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure you're seeing things where you're like, oh, wait, okay, that's how they said that. Um, and so what you see in Genesis 1 through 11 is this intense interest with sexual propagation, right? I mean, for obvious reasons, you have to
Hmm.
populate the earth, but not just human sexual propagation, animal sexual propagation too. You see this intense interest with fittedness to environment and this comes alive in Genesis 2 and 3. The man who is not called the man in Genesis 2 and 3, he's called the dirtling, which we unfortunately name Adam. We get
Adam.
this name Adam, which isn't a name. He's actually given a title, the dirtling, because he's taken from the dirt. And then after the fall, it's to the dirt he's going to return, right? So there's an intense discussion of that he comes from the dirt, that his wife comes from him. The animals also come from the dirt. The animals also have the breath of life and are called living creatures. So breath of life isn't actually anything that is unique to humans. It's actually
Hmm.
unique to animals, not plants and other things. And so there's all these connections. So sexual propagation, that you fit correctly to your environment, which is done and that's a moral issue in the Hebrew Bible, and in the New Testament. And that when as soon as they disobey God, what's the first curse is scarcity of resources that creates violence, right? So like, okay, scarcity of resources, they're wandering, what's going to happen next? Well, the earth turns violent, right? Okay, we're like, okay, well, at some point it just hit me like, hey, doesn't Darwin also talk about scarcity of resources, sexual propagation, and fit to environment, and in those three plus a few other things essentially create the conditions for natural selection? And he's obsessed with how those things work together. And I think his view of natural selection, I think, is pretty solid, and it's empirically testable. Like we have actual, you can do an experiment that shows, or observational experiments that show that his view of natural selection is correct. Now, whether natural selection accounts for all living creatures on the face of the earth the way they are today, that's a completely separate question, which
Right.
Darwin does eventually address. But his view of natural selection actually, you know, if I were just a human who took Genesis 1 through 11 seriously, what it thought was going on with creatures, humans, their environment, and sex as a means of propagating and filling the earth, um, I think if I were even just an atheist, Darwin's natural selection actually gives a pretty good account of what the biblical authors thought was the case. The part they don't include, that he doesn't include for obvious reasons, is for him, fit to environment is the one who, like, the rabbit that has the shorter ears and the thicker coat of fur can hang out in a colder environment. If that's the environment they're in, they're going to propagate more other rabbits like them because that's how they can fit. In the Bible, your moral actions are what fit you to the environment. So
Hmm.
when the man and woman disobey God, they're no longer fit to the environment of Eden. When Cain murders his brother, no longer fit to that environment. He's forced to wander. When the people of Israel become complicit in all kinds of heinous sins as a nation, God's like, you're out of here. The land is going to vomit you out, right? You're the
Right.
problem,
Right.
not the land. So that's the kind of exploration I do. I just go through each one of those aspects and say, okay, here's what Darwin said. Here's how modern evolutionary scientists have what they would consider improved upon Darwin. Um, and then here's what the biblical authors say. And like, okay, let's look at where the areas of conflict are, where's the areas of overlap, and we'll see. And there, basically, what I found is there are very interesting areas of overlap that I would not have expected until I kind of got in there and looked at them. And there are way more profound areas of conflict than I realized. So it's not just, well, because a lot of people will get hung up on that evolution requires randomness, but God guides everything. Like that's the conflict for them, right? And I'm like,
Okay.
oh no,
Hmm.
that's like a surface level conflict. There's some way deeper conflicts going on than that. So, and that was to put out to my colleagues too, who were kind of colleagues who are theistic evolutionists or evolutionary creationists, as they like to call themselves, who just kind of say like, look, evolution is how it all worked, and then then God chose this guy Abraham, and kind of that's where it all really began. Saying, I think there's, I was hoping to find some kind of nice resolution to all of this, but actually, the more I went, I was like, it's trickier than like everything. Like the knots got tighter rather than looser. In some areas,
Right.
I was like, oh, this isn't actually an issue for the biblical authors. Other areas, I was like, oh, this is a big one. So okay, so that was a lot, but that was essentially my case study of saying, hey, something that you just wouldn't expect the biblical authors to have anything to say about not evolution, whether it's true or not, but the actual working processes of natural selection that lead to the theory of evolution. Would they have anything to say about how natural selection itself works? Yes, they have a lot to say about it. Um, and man, if they have things to say about that, imagine what else they have to say about. So,
Wow. It's great. So what has it been like kind of meshing the Muslim and Jewish thought
hmm.
with all of that? What's that been like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's been very I think what it does is now this is like a room full of scholars, like 15 of us. And most of the people that we've recruited so far to participate in this project, they've been doing this for 20, 30 years, some 40, 50 years. They've been working in
Wow.
the science and religion kind of interface of science and religion. We got Oxford professors, Cambridge professors, uh, I mean, we have people from like, they're the ones who write the books that we've been reading. Um, but the other side of that effect is, but they're like a Christian professor who's been trying to do this for Christians, or they're a Muslim professor who's been trying to. So in this case, what happened, I think, and it was exciting to watch because I thought it was what was going to happen, but I wasn't sure. You never know when you get people in a room together.
Right.
Is the Christian professors like me or scholars are hearing the Muslim perspective, this one particular Muslim perspective, this Asharite Muslim view of determinism and how that might impact views of evolution. And we're all like, well, I didn't know any of that, right? Like that's all brand new to me, right? And then you're trying to think like, wait, do we have a version of this in Christianity? Is there something like this argument being made by somebody in Christianity? And sometimes you could go, oh yeah, this sounds like that one person in the medieval period that's making this argument. But essentially, what you're doing is you're kind of forced to step out of your own bubble and all
Hmm.
of a sudden hear all these different perspectives that are all talking about the same things you're interested in, but from such a different perspective that you kind of have to rethink everything, which is great. Which is, hopefully what scholarship is constantly doing is you're thinking and rethinking and critiquing.
Right.
Um, so I think a lot of people, especially the ones who had been doing this for a long time, found it especially exciting to get kind of shaken out of their world a little bit and go like, oh, I actually have no idea how Jews in the 20th and 19th century would react to evolutionary theory.
Right. So what is this doing to your faith? Because some people who get into more sciencey perspectives of things, especially involving scripture, they start to kind of deconstruct or,
Right.
doubt or so forth. So how is this kind of like stretching or moving your faith about?
Yeah, it's funny. That is not an issue for me at all. Not
Right.
even stretching. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because I became a believer when I was 20 and kind of like out of a very non-religious, non-Christian period of my life. So that doesn't bother me at all. I think I'm just curious. Like I just want to get to the bottom of things. Also, I have a secret weapon, which is after seminary, I studied analytic philosophy for 3 years. So I did another master's in analytic philosophy where I wrote on randomness. That's what I wrote my master's thesis on, is
Okay.
whether randomness was like a real thing, metaphysical, or whether it was just a perception that things are randomness, like nothing. That was my big question. Um, and what I found out from philosophy, which I'm very, lots of part of that philosophy degree I did not enjoy, but I did appreciate many of the things that I learned, which was that nobody has like there's not some group of people out there that has clear foundational certainty in what they believe. Not certainly not scientists, right? I mean, especially, I mean, even chemists, I thought chemistry was such this foundational rock solid science. And then you start talking to chemists and they're like, oh, actually, okay, this has got a lot of historical elements to it. There's a lot of we used to believe geology, there's a lot of we used to believe, but we now believe this. And by we used to believe, I mean like 50 years ago,
Wow.
right? So if you think about things like and this is not a knock on science. This is what's great about science is they're like trying to figure things out and they actually like will change their minds when reality forces them to.
Hmm.
DNA and plate tectonics, we did not know about those in my father's lifetime, right? Those are pretty monumental shifts in scientific thinking. And
Right.
you could even say in psychology, it was all behaviorism up until the 1960s. Um, Freudian psychoanalytics or behaviorism. Those were your two options essentially.
Hmm.
Um, so things have changed radically. And it was because of philosophy that I also learned, because everybody says, well, you still got math. One plus one is always two. Well, I learned in logic that actually, no, there are problems. When you're saying one plus one equals two, you are doing so in faith that the whole system of mathematics in which that you believe upholds the truth that two plus two equals four. Even a mathematician has to say, like, actually, we can't prove that, but we have really good reasons because to prove it's actually logically impossible to prove that two plus two is four in the way that we might want to.
Hmm.
Um, because what you end up doing is creating a set of relationships, if you know mathematics set theory, where you always have to rely on some rule outside of the set to complete what's inside the set, which means you're always putting trust in something that you can't prove. So there's what they say, there's always true things in any kind of mathematical equation that are unprovable, right? But they must be true in order for the math that I'm doing to
To
hold up.
work. Hmm.
So even when you get into like just finite math, just normal mathematic arithmetic, and you get into real high level math, it's a lot of like crazy whacked out stuff. Mathematicians will tell you math is a tool for helping us to understand the world. It's not reality itself, in some way. Um, so when I get into these discussions, I went into them. I just happened to do this philosophy degree because I was interested in it at the time. I go in them with full knowledge that like nobody has worked this out. Like Ecclesiastes is right. If a wise man claims to know, he doesn't. Like nobody has gotten behind the veil. Nobody actually has an answer that will give certainty or security to the degree that we really would love. Um, and so we're all curiously exploring together. And then the question is, well, what makes better explorers better and, dumber explorers dumber, right? And there are some really basic answers to that, right? Like dumb explorers in the world will sentimentalize and spiritualize things and romanticize things, and they'll ignore what reality is telling them, in front of their face. And good explorers tend to basically say, like, look, I got this idea and I'm going to put it out there and see whether reality, let reality call me out on it, right?
Hmm.
And this happens in relationships and all. I mean, you can say like, I have this idea that I'm a good husband, however, or a good father, right? I've got four grown children who can correct me, and if they came to me and said, "Hey, you are not a good father in this area of your life or something," darn tootin', I would listen very closely and adjust my belief of myself based on what they said, right? Not saying I'm the best explorer in the world, but if that happened to me, I would stop and take a check on myself about what I thought and have to realize, oh, I kind of romanticized myself that I kind of nailed it as a dad, but maybe I
Hmm.
didn't. So
Right.
obviously, I never thought that I nailed it as a dad, um,
I don't think
but
any parents think that
yeah,
they nail it as parents.
you can get tempted into that view every once in a while. So
Right.
the devil will
Right.
tempt you in that view.
There you go. So, kind of touching on philosophy, I know like next to nothing about philosophy or math. I
Yeah.
failed math throughout my entire
Oh,
lifetime.
me too. When I did that degree,
Really.
I took, yeah, well, we can trade stories, but I had to work my way up to college algebra in college,
I did
uh,
too. Yes.
and stopped there. And I was like, all right, I'm done. But philosophy of math has been very eye-opening. I was like, oh, I wish they taught math as a philosophical um, field because it's so much more interesting on the philosophy side. So I'm right there with you. I'd never taken a philosophy class before I did that master's.
It
So I
sounds
was
like
excited.
it. So I'm doing counseling for my master's degree and I have
Oh,
to take a statistics.
oh yeah.
I'm not
Statistics.
looking forward to that.
That was the class that opened up math for me though. Because I was
Really?
like, oh, math is useful finally. Because you take all these abstract math classes, you're like, what am I going to use this for? It's like, don't worry,
Yes.
you may need this someday, right? Statistics, every single bit of math you do is actually useful and you can see how it works. So I was like, oh, and it's also magical and philosophically crazy as well. Like I remember sitting in statistics, looking around at other people, and it was a big lecture hall,
Hmm.
going, is everybody hearing what this guy is saying up to the front? If what he's saying is true, this is like quasi magical. Like there is no logical explanation to what this dude is saying up there. So that's when I was like, oh, math has like this weird, like metaphysical property that you can use the same statistics in a bit in a business as you can in psychology, as you can in chemistry. Like you stop and think about that for a second. Like that shouldn't work. So I'm right there with you.
Okay, well, so when I take this class, I'll let you know if I
Yeah,
enjoy
I hope
it
I
or
hope
don't enjoy
stats does it
it.
for you. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see, we'll see. So, touching on philosophy, one book I do have of yours is the biblical philosophy one.
Oh, God love you.
Um,
That's the hard one.
really.
Yeah.
Well, I like a challenge, so I'm good with that. I don't mind. So, and I know like you're the founder of the Center for Hebraic Thought. I've read a couple of articles and stuff on there. Great stuff. So, what implications, well, first of all, can you kind of explain what Hebraic
Right.
philosophy is, and then what implications do you think it has for our theological methods?
Hmm. Yeah. So most simply, Hebraic, I only mean that because it starts in the Hebrew Bible from the Hebrew people, written in the Hebrew language mostly.
Hmm.
Um, so it's not meant to be anything more fancy than that. And to say it's the same thinking that Jesus learned as a child and grew up in, along with all kinds of other things. But Hebraic thought most basically is, did the biblical authors have thoughts about things, about the nature of things, about the order of things outside of, did they have thoughts about things like chairs or tables besides the chair they're sitting in? Right? Did they ever do that thing where you go like, what? Yeah, what makes a chair a chair? Now I know they're human, so I know they did at some point, but did they care enough to write those kinds of examinations into their text? And so here's some easy ones where you could say, um, Hebraic thought. Here, this is like the one that gets everybody both nervous and like helps them to see what the problem is.
Hmm.
Um, the biblical authors often do not make an argument about the nature of something in one place and one time and then say, okay, see argument 1A back on page whatever, we made that argument. They often scatter that argument across lots of different stories, poetry, law, lots of different ways. They come at it, they slice at it from different angles. So here's the one that always gets college freshmen up and running. When I say like, "Hey, where in the Bible does it say that you can't have sex before you're married? Like, where's that command?" Um, and they start throwing out things that they think are going on. I'm like, "No, where's the command that says you can't have sex? It says, okay, no sexual immorality, but that's pretty vague. Like, what does that mean? Um, and certainly what you think is sexual immorality is not what I would have thought it was when I was your age, and it's not what my
Right.
grandparents would have thought, right? That's like, so certainly we're not just going over some culturally coded. And eventually I lead them to the fact, the cold, hard fact that the Bible actually doesn't ever say that you can't have sex before you're married. No biblical author comes out and says that. Um, Instead, and I'll stick just to the books of Moses. If you read through the books of Moses with that question in mind, like, can I be sexually in sexual contact with somebody else if I'm not married to them? It becomes pretty clear through lots of different slices at that issue that, like, yeah, I don't think they would approve of me being sexually active outside of
Hmm.
not outside of a marriage or outside of my marriage, right? Both of those would count. And
Right.
it becomes pretty clear. And if you just, when students are like, because I'm a professor, so students they sit in my office and they literally say to me, like, where does it say I can't have sex with my boyfriend? Right. And I'm like, I'm like, actually, I know that sounds like a really pressing question to you, but that's the wrong question. The question is it wise, right? Is it wise to do that?
Right.
And for us, that sounds like a fluffy question, but for the biblical authors, that's life and death. Wise things lead to life and flourishing for others. Foolish things lead to death, and you always take people down with you.
Hmm.
Um, so Hebraic thought is just that, is like just saying like, okay, I've read a lot of the Bible. I know they would not be down with people having sex outside of marriage. But how do they make that argument? And then you kind of read through and say, "Oh, here, okay, here it shows up here. Okay, this thing they said here, well, it must be true. In order for this thing they said here to be true, it must also be true that they don't think you should be having sex outside of that marital relationship." And if you just stop in Genesis, you'd be helpless, right? Because people are having
Right.
sex with all kinds of things and other people in Genesis. So you really have to kind of hunker in and say, all right, what do they think and how do they talk about this thing they thought? And it's not easy. And I will just point out when because what happens is people are just like, just tell me. Like, when you play this game long enough, they're like, just tell me.
Right.
Um, and I'm happy to say, like, look, I'm a minister of the gospel. Yeah, no, I don't think it's wise. I think the biblical authors teach this pretty clearly across the scriptures. Um, but if you were with Jesus and you asked him that same question and you said, just tell me, I can tell you what he would do. He wouldn't have said he would have never given you that little nugget I gave you just now. He would have pushed you harder. He would be like,
Right.
well, what is sexual immorality to you? Right. And why do you call me teacher? I mean, who knows how he would mess with you because he messed with everybody.
Exactly.
So that's all I mean by Hebraic thought. We're already doing this. Sexual ethics is an easy one. But again, another easy one that I like that illustrates it well is the first five books of the Bible are all about the justice of God and how Israel is to be just. And if you were tempted to think that biblical justice means swift, punishing, harsh, tit for tat, you do this, here's the consequence. Well, just read the first five books of the Bible and you realize that's not actually what
Hmm.
justice is at all. Justice is mostly protective and protective of the most vulnerable within society. But because it's protective, it also has some elements that are swift and harsh. But those are few and far between. Um, but it doesn't ever give you that argument for justice like in one place. You got to read
Right.
across the whole thing and piece it together. And some people may see that as a weakness. I think anybody who stops and thinks about it for a second would see that as a strength. Because if you just put an argument in one place, people will just find a reason. Like my experience is if people don't like your argument, they will just find a reason to dismiss that argument in that one place or say why it's not actually there or it doesn't actually say what you think it says. But when you embed that argument across the text in various ways and places, it's really hard to get rid of it. Let me give a physical example. My mom died of Alzheimer's, and of course, you start researching all kinds of things about behaviors, things that you're seeing in your
Hmm.
loved ones. Like, is this normal? What's going on here? Um, and even when my mother was catatonic and couldn't interact at all, and like she couldn't talk, have a conversation, say anything, she could still sing her favorite songs
Wow.
like perfectly, right? So I was like, what's up with that? So I looked, it turns out now they don't know exactly how this is the case, but song lyrics and songs are one of the few things that don't have a spot in the brain. Like there's a lot of places in the brain that do certain functions. There's
Hmm.
no place in the brain where you store songs. They're stored across the whole brain. So Alzheimer's deteriorates physically the brain, which means that the part of you that resists that physical deterioration the longest is the songs. So this is why I always, the college freshman, I'm like, so be careful of what songs you're singing right now because they're probably the ones you'll be singing in the nursing home.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So unless you really like that Kanye West song that much, like that's the one that's going to pop out of you when everything else is gone and you don't remember who your own children are. That's the one that's going to stay. But that to say, the way you embed something that resists deterioration and makes it stronger is you scatter it across, right? And
Hmm.
so the biblical authors are doing something like that, which is, it's a remarkable way to create wisdom across generations.
That's great. That's great.
So when I say
So,
Hebraic thought, that's all I mean.
Okay.
In the modern world, we would call that a philosophical tradition. But
Right.
yeah.
Right. So I feel like you and I could probably have a good conversation on like biblical law because my background, like my bachelor and stuff, is criminal justice and
Oh,
criminal
wow. Okay.
psychology. And so I'm in love with the Old Testament. That is where I spend most of my time when I read, and the Torah is definitely the place that I try to just dissect everything and God's
Right.
justice and his judicial system, all of that. So, can you talk to me a little bit about your upcoming biblical law book? Because I'm looking forward to that one. Like
Yeah.
what's in there? What's that all about?
Yeah. It's I should caveat it's a book, it's a short book. It's 200 pages, but I think they've made the spaces really wide on it or something. It really could easily be like 100, 120 pages. Um, but it's essentially a skill book. So if you think of Duolingo as
Hmm.
you learn vocabulary in Duo. I don't know if people play or mess with Duolingo, but it's really you're trying to learn how to read and speak a particular language and how to avoid common errors. So with law, especially if you came out of criminal justice, you'll understand. You can probably see more clearly than me. It's very natural if you're an American or someone in the Western, so-called Western world. We just have certain concepts of law. One of them is that a law is legislated by some body, like
Hmm.
some government says, here's the rule, and it's a rule that you break or keep, right? And that's
Right.
it. That's the only option. You either go above the speed limit, the rule is legislated, you have to go the speed limit says 55, you either break or keep that. Um, so that's not how biblical law works at all. But most people are like, well, I don't have another, like, I don't have another concept. Like, what do you mean it doesn't work that way? How else does law work, right? So a lot of it is me trying to very slowly unfold, like, here's how biblical law works. Here's how it's a lot like ancient Near Eastern law, but here's a lot of ways in which it's not like it's very unique, even amongst other law codes in the ancient Near East. So it's kind of doing its own thing, but it's more like ancient Near Eastern laws than it is like our laws.
Hmm.
Um, so a lot of it is building the skills of reading, and then, I'm not covering all the content. So if you have a really dicey law that really drives you crazy in the Old Testament, 50-50 chance as to whether I even talk about it in that book. Because I'm in that book, I'm trying to say, like, here's some things that if you understand these things and you kind of get this skill of asking these questions when you read a law, um, it will help you to better situate that law and think about what might be going on there. The trick with biblical law is we have no idea how they practiced it. So
Right.
there are no stories. There are a few, but they're very few, where they say, well, according to the Torah, it says that we should do this. So we did this on day 3 of whatever. Like, they don't do that, right? They don't tell us about how they followed the law. We just know that it's supposed to be read every 7 years or 3.5 years, depending on what their cycle was. We don't know if they actually did read it aloud to everybody, in their
Hmm.
tribes. There are indications that people had some familiarity with it for a while, but that seems to die off at some point because they seem so shocked when they actually do find the law and read it out loud
Yes.
later.
Yes.
Everybody seems so shocked by what it says that it's like, okay, I guess the oral tradition didn't hold that long if that's what was
Right.
going on. Um, so yeah, that's all I'm trying to do. And because I got sick of I was starting every chapter out with, well, here's what we think about this area of law or this idea of law. And that's not going to help you at all in biblical law. So, throw that away.
Hmm.
And that's just not a good way to start out every chapter, right? So I was like, I got to find a way to do this positively rather than just telling everybody they're wrong all the time. Which, don't get me wrong, I really enjoy telling people they're wrong. It's a very deep sinful part of me.
I get
Um,
that. Me too.
yeah. So I did write a quarter of the book is a fictional historical fiction of a young girl who's walking between a village in Iron Age Israel and finds a dead body, and then the villages trying to show how the villages might, again, because it's also, we don't know, how they might have used the stories and the laws of the Torah to kind of negotiate what do they do with this body they found, and how do they determine whether somebody's guilty of murder in this case.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
there's a whodunit alongside
That's great.
to try and help demonstrate. And I had a few of my Jewish colleagues who are really good on law read it, and they thought it was good. So I was like, okay, okay. I didn't. The only problem with my story is a friend of mine, archaeologist Cynthia Schaefer Elliott. She read the fiction. I said, hey, can you just read this fiction and make sure that I'm describing an ancient village correctly and some of their behaviors? I don't want to get too out of sorts. And she read it and she's like, this is great. One problem is the premise of the whole story just would never have happened. Like no 15-year-old girl would ever be walking by herself between two villages.
Uh,
And I was like, yes, that's probably true. We do have cases like Ruth and Boaz who had to travel from Moab back over to Bethlehem
mhm.
by themselves, and that actually is part of the tent. So I kind of took a little, license with that and said, okay, but let's say there was this one instance, right? So
Yeah, because you never know.
you
Could have
never know.
been at least one
Well, and I actually
situation.
did use Bedouin law because there's some Bedouin thinking in law that seems to have percolated. I mean, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all Bedouins, right? The Israelites were considered shepherds, even amongst Egyptians, right? The
Hmm.
Egyptians wouldn't eat with them because they were shepherds and they're
Right.
abomination. So there's this kind of line of scholarship that says there is this Bedouin aspect to the biblical law that you don't find in the imperial laws of Babylon and Assyria. Um, and Bedouin law actually does allow for women to be off on their own, shepherdesses to be off on their own, miles and miles away from their family, because there's an absolute code of conduct that if you like, she's actually protected even though she's miles away from her family because everybody knows if anybody touches her, her brothers and her father are going to hunt that person down until they kill him.
Oof.
Um, so there's this like virtual protection. And actually you do see that in Genesis 34 with Dinah and
Yes.
Shechem, right?
Yeah.
And that her
Right.
father wouldn't take action, but her brothers
Mhm.
are
Her
like,
brothers.
uh-uh,
Oh
no,
yeah.
we're gonna go kill all these people because they let this happen, right? So I was taking license, but it was actually like I felt like it was on, you know,
Still on par. Yeah, a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah, it's on some foundation, not none.
Right.
So
That's
that's
great.
that's the book. It's meant to be short and sweet and like just get you to like, oh, okay, now I can make sense of a lot more of these laws than I could before.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I think it'll scratch me right where I itch. So,
Good, you'll let me know, especially from criminal justice
yeah,
perspective, because
I will let you know.
I did talk to a lot of lawyers who had to explain to them. That was the funnest and worst part of that book was I talked to a bunch of former students who are now lawyers. My brother's a lawyer, and just had them like talk through American law with me.
Hmm.
And it was both like, oh, okay. And also like, wait, what? That's how American law works. There are there were some genuinely shocking in a bad way, like
Yes.
things that
Yes.
happen in America law that I don't know if they could be any other way. It's nobody's fault, but like even how common law gets used in American law, you're like, oh, I guess that's just what we do. Okay.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
pretty dicey, pretty weird
I
sometimes, some
started to
instances.
understand much more the get a lawyer mentality. Like
Yes.
anything happens, get a lawyer,
Get a
don't talk.
lawyer.
Yeah.
Yep. That's
So,
that's true. That's exactly it. That's
yeah.
all you can do. That's great. So with all these different people that you meet, these different scholars that you talk to, different backgrounds, cultures, etc. Has there ever been anyone on your podcast that you just hardcore disagreed with, or that you were like, "Ooh, maybe I shouldn't publish this," or
Oh, yeah. Certainly. I mean, I'm a scholar. I mean,
right?
scholars always disagree with even my
Yep.
closest colleagues who I feel like our hearts almost directly connect on an issue. I still can't fully agree. Which is good. I mean, I think so. We hold our disagreements with looseness, kind of like,
Hmm.
oh yeah, maybe I'm just not seeing something that they're seeing, or um, I had very rarely. I always promise a friendly interview, like you're giving me here. You may disagree with some things I say, but I'm always friendly. I mean, I in college I started listening to NPR. And now NPR has changed quite a bit in the last 30
Hmm.
years since I listened to it. But one thing I've always appreciated about NPR is they do long form interviews where they just let you hear they just let the person talk, right? Like
Yeah.
you're doing right. You're just letting me,
Oh
if
yeah,
I'm
go
if I'm
ahead.
messing myself up, then you're your own problem, right? But part of that I think I came to respect was that they just assumed that whoever was listening could kind of hear what the person had to say for themselves and kind of suss it out, right?
Right.
And so I think my approach has always been, I mean, there's been a few times when I know what they're saying is going to sound controversial to people, and I'll say like, okay, what do you say to the person who might push back and say, right? Sometimes the person is me. I just don't say like I'm the person who would push back and say, no, that's not right.
Yeah.
Only one interview I've had, and it wasn't for my podcast. It was for my other podcast, which I co-host with some other people, called OnScript.
Hmm.
I had a book where, and I'm friends with the guy who wrote the book. Um, I respect him very greatly, but the book made so many logical fallacies and came to such illogical conclusions. I joked that I had to duct tape it to my hands when I read it because I wanted to throw it against the wall.
Oh my gosh.
So so yeah, so when we got on the podcast with this person, we just basically pushed them very hard and said, "Well, what would you say to the person? Well, how do you incorporate this passage? How you don't seem to have taken this passage into account." Um, but for the most part, I assume the listener, if you drop in for one episode, maybe you don't pick all this up. But if you listen regularly, you'll be able to figure things out for themselves. People are really smart. This is what I've realized.
Yeah.
Um, me and my wife both come from kind of broken families, and so we've got people who don't have high educations, they've had drug addiction in the family or whatever. But once you get to know these people over 30, 40, 50 years now, um, you realize even someone who's a drug addict who's lived on the street for a while, who didn't finish high school, they can actually figure things out. Like,
Oh, for
like,
sure.
like they actually know some things, and actually they might even have advice worth listening to. Learned all the hard way, right? So I just assume that if people are listening and paying attention, that they can hear what's good. They can, as a systematic theology professor of mine in seminary used to say, they can chew the meat and spit out the bones. Um, and that doesn't come easy, and it doesn't, sometimes that'll take a while of thinking about what you heard or what was said. Um, I just hate being in the position. I take it back. I love being in the position of telling people what they should think, but I know that's wrong about me. And so I really like want to be in the position where I just let people figure things out. And I won't baptize this and say like, "Hey, this is exactly what Jesus did,"
Hmm.
but it is what Jesus did. And I've made arguments in several books, even in the creation narrative, when God helps the man to see who his proper mate is. He doesn't tell her this is your wife, you found her. He actually like lets him see for himself. So this is a
Hmm.
biblical ethic of you guide people along the way. You ask the right questions like you're doing, right? Um, but you but it's creationally good to let people see things for themselves. Like that's a
Right.
good thing. It's a
Right.
good parenting technique. It's a good teaching technique. It's a good friend technique, right? I mean, think of Nathan when he confronted David,
Hmm.
very cleverly helped David see for himself, right, that
Yes.
what the problem was. So,
Yes. I love that narrative. That's a good one. That's who I would be. Kind of person I am sometimes.
yeah.
So on that note, any wisdom for a budding biblical scholar who will not have the credentials to back that up? And I'm working on a book, so
Oh,
a little
yeah, a book.
complex.
Okay. What's
Yeah.
the book about?
I'm doing an exploration on God's or holy grief and examining his heart. So,
Oh, nice.
yeah, called The God Who Laments.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Something
So,
churches just don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. So,
yep. Yep.
um, that's great. Yeah, I think I mean, I always give the same advice. Listen to the text, know what God said through his prophets first, and put everything in conversation with that.
That's great.
Theological method has become such that every conversation I have with a professional theologian, even ones I deeply respect, even ones who like really do put scripture in conversation with their theology, it doesn't start with scripture. It's like they've already got their theology, and now let's figure out how to backwards strap scripture onto our theology. Um, and I just think that that's the wrong way around. And so I'm always pushing people to say, like, hey, your theology, you might end up coming back to your theology through the lens of scripture and saying, hey, actually, my theology looks pretty good through the lens of scripture, but you got to do the work.
Right.
And I think that's what the church can do because actually a listener just sent me a paper they wrote the other day that was incredibly great on old wineskin. It was a passage I had puzzled about for a long time, the old wineskins, new wineskins. And she
Uh-huh.
had written this essay that I was like, yeah, I think I'm actually with you on this one. And she's like, I have no formal training whatsoever. She just like sat down. It was something that puzzled her. She was curious. She did the work. She thought it out. It's a really good essay. That to
That's
me is
great.
like that's the best stuff in the world when this is my job. This is what I do for a living. I have to like crank stuff out. When normal people can do it, it can show me things that I've never seen and no matter how, like that's the cream of like the cream of the crop. I can't It doesn't
Right.
get better than that. So I love it when lay people take the time and the efforts their efforts pay off and they get to see things and teach each other. I think that's what the church is actually supposed to do. I'm in the position where I get to help put up some guardrails and guide a little bit. But in no way do I see biblical scholarship as the people who know. There's a guy named Dan McClellan. God bless him. I don't know what his personal story is, but he loves telling everybody why they're wrong constantly. Like his video feed is, and he's a good biblical scholar, ancient Near Eastern historian. He's very good. And half the things I'm like, yeah, he's kind of right. Um, but man, he sets up the world so that he's the one who and he sets up
Mm.
his scholarship so that if you're a layperson, you should be terrified of saying anything around him, and if you really want to know, therefore you have to come to him because he's the one who really knows. And I just don't think
Wow.
that's how the church works. And
No, no.
I'm not saying anything I haven't said publicly about Dan McClellan. Dan McClellan's a very public figure. Maybe I could have him on my podcast sometime. I don't know if he would do it. Um, but and like to talk about that method, but I think that method is fundamentally flawed. So
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate all that. I got some notes here.
yeah, thanks,
So
Lauren.
yeah, no problem. That's all I have. Any last comments? Any other words you want to slip on in?
Um, may your podcast grow to 10,000.
If only.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm just going with the flow.
yeah. I love it.
All good to me. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Drew Johnson with the Biblical Mind. I hope we can keep in touch, exchange some conversation
Yeah.
here and there, and be blessed on all your travels coming up.
Oh, thank you very much, Lauren.
Yeah. So talk soon. Have a good day.